Morning, folks. Everything new under the sun. Two articles I want to take a look at this morning about North America, Russia, potentially, World War III when you're talking about it. This is a zerohedgearticle.com. It's real. It's coming. It's a matter of time. U.S. general warns of hypersonic attack. Now, we've spoken of hypersonic vehicles, and we know that Russia effectively, Putin came out and basically grandstanded and says that they have hypersonic weapons, and this is hard to defend against. And so the Air Force Lieutenant General Samuel Greaves, director of Missile Defense Agency, said he has the full support of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, Michael Griffin, to advance the development of space-based sensors that would defend the nation against hypersonic attacks. This is kind of the next big thing. This is the Star Wars, effectively, that I believe it. Trump basically said they need a Star Wars force, a space force, basically. The Pentagon believes funding will be in place next year to be a constellation of missile surveillance satellites amidst new warnings of hypersonic weapons being tested and deployed by Russia and China. So this is a clear and present danger for North America. And we're going to take a look at a next article here about an Atlantic deployment of the USS Harry Truman. Hypersonic threat is real. It's not imagination, Greaves said, emphasizing that defending against hypersonic missile attacks has become a top priority for the agency. So that article goes on. I'll put the link in the description. But that's interesting news that they're pushing forward with missile defense strategy and effectively satellites to find these, because they're so fast. You got to find them fast. You got to have eyes in the sky, effectively, to do something about them before they get too close. Well, this is a clear and present danger now in the Atlantic. Carrier USS Truman deployed to Atlantic as Russian submarine activity surges. So we have an increase in Russian activity. And, when you look to the collapse of the U.S. dollar, the collapse of the United States as a world reserve currency and as a superpower, one scenario could be Russia taking control by launching a preemptive strike. And you talk about mutually assured destruction, and that may be a large part of the case. But Russia is so spread out, and likely they would still be left standing even after a nuclear holocaust, whereas the United States would probably fall to its knees, effectively, because North America is a first world continent for the most part. Maybe not Mexico. Mexico, yeah. But certainly Canada and the United States. And we wouldn't be able to handle a cutoff of electronics, a cutoff of machinery, etc. Whereas Russia, they're a bit more old-fashioned. They could probably withstand, and their military would be left standing. Their land mass is massive, larger than Canada. I believe it is. I don't know. Maybe they're both very large, Canada and Russia. I think Russia is a little bit bigger. But they could potentially be left standing. So you look at Russian war games, threats, and aircraft flying around Britain, and the Royal Air Force having to deploy and intercept Russian aircraft. Now you have Russian submarines going all throughout the world, basically projecting their forces all around the world. Russia is modernizing its submarine force around Europe, interestingly, to directly challenge American naval dominance. Greater than any other period since the Cold War, Admiral James Fago told Stars and Stripes in an interview last week. The commander said the U.S. must expand its naval force along with enhancing its submarine fleet to combat Russian aggression in the region. Tensions between Russia and NATO have never been higher. So you think about Cold War, etc., and lead up to what potentially is effectively World War III. This is all significant information that you need to be aware of. According to a new report by United States Naval Institute, the USS Harry S. Truman, the 8th Nimitz-class aircraft carrier of the U.S. Navy, has exited the Mediterranean Sea and is now patrolling the Atlantic Ocean, of unnamed defense official said. Well, the Truman, there's an image there of the Truman, conducts a straight transit. Truman is currently deployed as part of an ongoing rotation of U.S. forces. Earlier this week, the Truman, a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier, base at Naval Air Station Oceana, Virginia, and its support vessels sailed through the Strait of Gibraltar, a narrow strait that connects to the Atlantic Ocean, and so they're going through basically around the Atlantic Ocean. And that's kind of an interesting scenario that effectively they're looking for Russian submarines there. Russian submarine activity searches. So again, it's one of those things you don't necessarily always see on the Atlantic coast. There's a lot of Pacific coast stuff happening, a lot of activity there, but the Atlantic coast you don't see as much, being between Britain, Europe, and North America. But interesting situation. I'll put the links in the description. You can check it out. But it's just these are sorts of articles that you just want to keep an eye on. It doesn't mean anything right now necessarily, but as we see the world cascading downwards, spiraling downwards, we see economic collapse coming up on the horizon, and something that can be a clear and present danger there. We see wars and rumors of wars and all these things happening as the Bible speaks of in the last days occurring. You got to look at these things and say, which one of these is going to be a trigger point? Which one of these really is basically telling us that we're very close and it could happen at any time now? You need to know Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, because He's coming back soon. I think we have less than 10 years before the second coming of the Lord. I think we have less than 3 years before the 7-year tribulation starts. I could be wrong. Ultimately, we know that Christ is going to return, and He's going to deal with the world, but the world's going to get a lot worse and harder than it is now, and persecution will increase significantly, especially to Christians, and times will be hard. And we don't know if those hard times include an economic collapse, but I kind of suggest and think that they will, because Western powers are not really mentioned in end-time Bible prophecy in Psalm 83 and Ezekiel 38. These are all Middle East wars with Middle East players, Russia, and China, 200 million man standing army, etc., marching on Israel. These are all end-time Bible prophecies, and there's none that really indicate that any major Western powers are involved. So what happens to them in the last days? Are they simply silent? I think an economic collapse occurs. They have no money or will or ability to project military power, and so they can't stand up for Israel, because ultimately God's orchestrating it so that He can show His power, and ultimately the IDF will be left standing, and they will be overwhelmed by Gog-Magog forces pushing against them. And ultimately, God's going to be able to show His power once and for all, once no other powers in the world can save Israel. And that's when Israel effectively turns back and says, God, come save us. We can't do it on ourselves. So interesting stories, and these are all a lead up to end-time events, I believe. So thanks for watching, guys. I'll leave it there. Put links in the description, and I'll see you guys in the next video.